Joined now by former Congressman Bill Owens, who was a consultant on U.S.-Canada relations and cross-border trade. Nice to see you. Welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be here.
President Trump has followed through on imposing tariffs on outside steel and aluminum from the European Union, Mexico, and Canada. The administration saying they are needed to protect U.S. steel and aluminum manufacturers, American jobs, and even for national security. Will these tariffs, 25% for steel, 10% for aluminum, help do that?
I don't think so, Tom. First of all, I don't think it's going to help bring jobs back to the United States or increase production substantially that will have a positive impact on the communities that have been devastated by the loss of manufacturing. It's very expensive to expand or build a new plant to produce aluminum or steel. That takes years of planning, capital investment. So I don't see this as happening. And in terms of the idea that Canada poses a national security threat to the United States, I find just baffling. The logic of this absolutely leaves me bewildered. This is just a play to Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, with no hope in those communities, in reality, of jobs returning in the steel or aluminum industries. So what's the point? It's to keep a political promise that is not based on either good economics or an understanding of international trade.
Of course, there's the aluminum plant, Alcoa in Messina, shut down one of the plants a few years ago. Unions there, they are hopeful that it could lead to them at least retaining jobs, if not bringing some production back.
That's right, and certainly that's been the reaction. But the fact of the matter is that the biggest impactor on the plant in Messina has been low prices for aluminum. And that's not going to be impacted by putting tariffs on it, because that's going to cause the price to the users of the aluminum to go up. Now we have the Canadians saying on July 1st, they will impose tariffs on aluminum imports into Canada from the United States. So that means the cost in Canada will also go up. Who's the end loser? The consumer. So again, the logic of this and sort of the understanding of the ripple effects is completely missing.
When it comes to steel, Canada buys a lot of U.S. steel. The U.S. has a $2 billion surplus with Canada.
Right.
And Canada buys half of the U.S. steel that is
55%.
exported. So a lot of people may scratch their head. Why do you target Canada?
A lot of people should be scratching their heads, because this makes no sense. I mean, you're basically saying to your largest purchaser of steel that you want them to buy less. And again, how does that help the steel worker in the United States if Canada buys less? Is there suddenly some other marketplace that's going to open that steel can be sold to? Seems unlikely in the short term. So this is going to have the same effect as the Smoot-Hawley tariffs had in the 1930s, and it will create a trade war, and it will create protectionism, and it will impact negatively world trade and therefore the economy in all of the countries that are involved. I think it's also going to have a tremendous negative impact on the NAFTA negotiations with Canada and Mexico. How do they trust the United States to go forward in good faith under a new NAFTA when, with existing NAFTA, the United States is essentially violating it by imposing these tariffs?
And speaking of NAFTA, how are the talks going? When they were held here in Montreal in early January, there was some optimism coming out of them. How have things progressed since then, and what impact does all of this have on those talks? So
I think they were making some progress, but then the United States about 2 weeks ago put in higher, again, more rigid demands on auto production. That slowed the talks down yet again. Now you have these tariffs that have been put in place. I think if the talks are not completely bogged down or terminated, I will be very surprised. Now, he certainly could rip up NAFTA and create a lot of chaos. And that is one of the things I think everyone's afraid of, because you don't know whether tomorrow morning he'll get up and tweet that he's tearing up NAFTA because he didn't like what Trudeau said in response.
Over the weekend, he tweeted and talked about perhaps the U.S. should go the route of bilateral deals with Canada and with Mexico. Is that a possibility? Is that if the current NAFTA talks fail, is it possible you could end up with bilateral deals with both countries?
I suppose you could. I can't imagine the Canadians and Mexicans being particularly enthused with the idea of entering into a bilateral deal. In addition to that, the Canadians and Mexicans would have to enter into a bilateral agreement also, because so many goods move from Canada to Mexico, back to Canada, or back to the United States. You'd have to have a fairly complex set of documents to make this work, because we already have supply chains in place that are based upon NAFTA. If you suddenly modify that, it's going to be very difficult to come up with agreements that will allow that traffic to move as freely as it does today.
You mentioned Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He says this is totally unacceptable. So what is the Prime Minister likely to do about it?
Well, he has already announced tariffs in retaliation that will go into effect on July 1st. Two categories, one with a 25% tariff, another with a 10% tariff. The 25% tariffs are focused on steel products and aluminum products, and then some of the 10% tariffs are more, if you will, general items. But this is going to create some really interesting issues. Assuming this goes forward, take our tourism and shopping business that we do down here with Quebecers. Someone comes down, buys a product, gets back to the border, declares what they've purchased, and finds out now they either have a 10 or a 25% tariff imposed on those goods. A good example is sleeping bags and maple syrup, things that consumers would likely buy. They get to the border, and all of a sudden the goods now cost them 10% or 25% more. Two things happen. One, discourages people from shopping because they're not going to know what the complete list is. Two, it creates delays at the border as people are forced to go inside and pay the duty. It's going to create a lot of unintended consequences that, again, the Trump administration has simply not thought through.
There are the consumer goods, if tariffs are slapped on those. What about products made here in the North Country or in Quebec? What could this potentially do to the great trade relationship between Quebec and Northern New York?
That may not be as impacted as you might think, partially because of the Made in America provisions that apply to the transportation sector that's been so healthy here in our communities. So that's already built in to some extent, that people are buying American-made pieces to put into a larger product. So I think in the short term, not much negative impact. Longer term, it's not clear to me exactly how that plays out. One of the areas that I think is particularly insulting to Canadians is that they are deemed to be a national security threat. And the Prime Minister has indicated that's very problematic from his perspective. The Canadians are not only angry about the tariffs, but they're insulted because of the support we've given, that they've given to the United States in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, in NORAD. It's just unfathomable to me that they could draw that conclusion. It's clearly a pretense.
And the backlash beyond NAFTA and the tariffs, does it hurt U.S.-Canada relations?
I think it does. I think when you say to somebody, we consider you a national security threat, who's been a brother in arms for 50 or 60 years, that's a real problem.
Let's talk midterm elections a little bit. Lots of challengers running in the House and Senate primaries. Many candidates motivated by Donald Trump to get into the races. 6 months ago, it looked as if the Democrats were poised to make some real gains, especially in the House. Has that optimism faded somewhat? The president's numbers have gone up. The economy's in good shape. Unemployment, the lowest it's been since 1969. Some growing tired of the Mueller investigation. With 5 months out before the midterm elections now, are the Republicans in a much better position than they were?
I think they are. I think that the enthusiasm, I think, is still there, but I think the ability of the Democrats to deliver and to have a message that counters what's happened with strong economy, including low unemployment rates, I think is going to weigh very heavily against the Democrats. The only area that I think Democrats can make some hay, if you will, is the fact that there is still the lagging behind of middle class wages. That has still not moved materially. And I think that if the Democrats hone in on that and indicate that all of these good things that have happened have not benefited the middle class, then I think they may be able to make some progress. But I think it's going to be much harder than it appeared 6 months ago.
In our region, the primary race for your old seat in New York 21, the crowded field of Democrats has shrunk from 10 at one point down to 5 now. With the primary just 3 weeks away on June 26, is there a clear frontrunner?
Not that I've been able to observe. I've said for a long time that whichever one of these candidates can get out the vote in their county, then they're likely to win.